Welcome back everyone to this channel, and in this TensorFlow tutorial, today I'm going to explain how to iterate over a tensor. So let's first know about the term iterate over. So iterate over is a term used in every programming language. It is the way to visit each element of collection of items sequentially one by one. And the collection can be any iterable data structure such as a dictionary, set, list, or the tensor. So this tutorial is about TensorFlow. So we will see how we can iterate over tensor only. So we can use two methods. In first method, we will use the for loop to iterate over a tensor, and in the second, we will use the while loop. And if you are a Python programmer and as a Python beginner, you must already know how for loop and while loop works. So let's begin. So first import the TensorFlow library. So write import TensorFlow as TF, and after this let's create a tensor data. So tensor data, and here I'm going to use a constant function of tensor to create a tensor data and provide a list of values on which you will iterate using for loop. So here I'm going to take the country name like a USA. This is the list of a string and we will iterate over it. And second is the Brazil, and third is the Australia. Let's take one more string value, and which is a Canada. Now this is tensor data contains a list of strings and we can iterate over it. And for that let's write a for data in tensor data, then print the data value. So here this for data represent the each element of this list. So this is your tensor data. This tensor data contains a list of a string and its type is tensor. Let me also print the type. So we don't need to print the type, it will automatically print because we are printing here data. Let's execute this block of code. As you can see in the output, it iterated over each element of the tensor data, and you can see here the first tensor data is the string USA and its type is a string, and the second is Brazil, and third Australia, and fourth is the Canada. So here using the for loop we iterated over a tensor data. This is the tensor data, its type is tensor. If we print its type, let's check its type, print, and then use the Python type function and type here tensor data. Execute this cell. Look, its type is a eager tensor. So the format of this variable tensor data is a eager tensor, or it is in tensor format. So this is how you can iterate over tensor data using the for loop. You can access the individual value. Now next, let's see how we can do that using the while loop. So for while loop, let's again initialize another tensor data. So here I'm going to store that tensor data into a tensor values named variable. Then tf dot constant. Let's create a list of integer. So here I'm gonna use a list of integer 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 5, 5 like this. And let's initialize a two variable. First tensor length, and this variable will store the length of this tensor values variable. So for that you can use the Python length function and pass the tensor values variable like this. So this line will store the length of this tensor values variable. So its length will be 4 because it contains a 4 element. Now let's also create one more variable data and initialize it with value 0. Now let's use the while loop. While, so I want to print all the values of this tensor values or tensor variable. while data is less than tensor len, and if you don't use this, your loop will run forever or it will run for infinite time. Then print tensor values, then data, accessing each element, and finally increasing the value of data by 1 each time, plus equal to 1. Let's execute this block of code. So now you can see you get all the elements of the tensor values using the while loop. So here we have initialize data equal to 0 and tensor len equal to length of this tensor values variable. So let me explain how this is working. So here it checks condition. If data is less than tensor, that means you can see initial value of data is 0, and you can represent this condition like this, and tensor len value, current value is 4, because if you print here, let me show you, if you print the tensor len value, you will get its size is 4. You can see here, because this tensor value variable contains 4 elements. Now as you can see, whenever this loop runs, first time it checks data is less than tensor len, which means 0 is less than 4, and that is true because currently the value of data is 0. So it executes this line of code, and here use the concept of indexing to access the value of tensor variable. So here you can represent this one like this, tensor values, and then within this 0 like this. So this means accessing the first element of a tensor values, and then finally after printing the element, we are incrementing the data value by 1. So this means data equal to data plus 1. That means again 0 plus 1, and which assigns a value or initialize value of data to 1. So in the next iteration it becomes 1, and when it again checks 1 is less than 4, which is true, so again it executes the next line, and here instead of 0 it uses 1, and then it accesses the second element of the list like this and print it on the terminal. So same way it goes till 4, and after 4 it stops the while loop and it prints all the values of the list. You can see here 23, 56, 78 and 55. So this is how you can use the while loop to iterate over a tensor, and this is the very basic concept of for loop, while loop. And if you have ever used a for loop, while loop on a Python list, and the same concept is applied here, only change is the data type of the variable. You can see data type is a tensor. So I hope that you understand how to iterate over a tensor in a TensorFlow using for and while loop. So at last I want to say, don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel, and thank you.